Hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa Shear. I'm also a member at March for Science New York City. We're really happy you're here today for our awesome panel, hopefully awesome panel on food policy. So I'm going to give the introductions before we get started to introduce the topic and a little bit about our wonderful panelists. But first, in case this is your first time with us with March for Science New York City, I want to tell you what we're all about. So March for Science New York City is the official satellite of the National March for Science organization, and we are a nonpartisan organization made up of a diverse group of scientists, mostly grad students and postdocs across New York City. And we stand for three major things, those being the open access to scientific information to the general public, and also the use of science for the common good and the preservation of an informed democracy, and also for the protection of human and environmental rights. And additionally, at March for Science, our motto is educate to empower, and that's what we're trying to do with this panel series and what we're going to be talking about today. And this panel series that you've seen referred to as STEM the Vote is composed of 8 panels that are about the 8 most important pressing issues for the upcoming elections for this fall. So we're doing this panel series to hope that we can all together become more informed voters heading into the polls this year, so that we can support policies and candidates that are backed by data and science. And so each week we have a new panel made up of a policy expert and a community activist, and together they will inform us on the current state of affairs in regards to policy and also future work that can and needs to be done, and also ways that we can improve our communities on the ground in addition to voting. And we think both of these efforts, both voting and being civically engaged in our communities, are really vital to positive change going forward. And also I want to give a quick shout out to some of our supporters for this panel series, that being the Science Rising campaign and also the Union of Concerned Scientists, who contributed some funding for this series. Everyone should go check out the Science Rising Challenge, which is basically a 3-part challenge where we're all to register to vote and also to make a voting plan. And also they have several other activities such as recruiting other science enthusiasts like yourself to go out and vote and to become more civically engaged. So for today's topic, we'll be discussing issues surrounding food policy and food security, such as how COVID-19 and also the climate crisis are both really revealing vulnerabilities in our food systems and supply chains, and also how our food systems are not built for racial, social, or economic justice, and how these are a huge problem that we need to fix going forward. So for today, we have 2 awesome panelists and then our awesome moderator, Omar. First, I'll introduce Dr. Molly Anderson, who is a professor at Middlebury College in Vermont. And she's an expert on a variety of topics within food policy, such as sustainable food systems and human rights in the food system as well. She's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, along with many other organizations. And also Dr. Anderson has a strong interest in connecting the concerns of academics, activists, and social movements, which makes her perfect for our panel series here today. And then additionally, we have Karen Washington, who has spent an extremely impactful 35 years in community activism, focused on bringing community gardens and fresh food to the Bronx in New York City. Karen has been the president and a board member of the New York City Community Garden Coalition, which works to protect community gardens throughout our city. She's also the co-founder of Black Urban Growers, which works to build networks among Black farmers, and also co-owner of the Rise and Root Farm, where she works at and helps to bring food to lots of food, like farmers markets throughout the city. And she's also a board member of several other food justice organizations throughout New York. And then finally, our discussion will be moderated by March for Science's own co-founder, Omar Gowayed, who is currently a PhD candidate at NYU, who, in addition to studying lasers, which he's always very excited to tell us about, also started a vertical farm program at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. Okay, so that's the end of the intro. So Omar, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, and Alyssa, for the wonderful intros. Also, I do want to say for the people who are out, who are watching, thank you again for coming. Please don't forget to put any questions in the Q&A section. We've turned off the chat. Don't raise your hand. Just put the question inside of the Q&A section, and I'll do my best to get to it. So let's get started. I actually wanted to kick us off with something that's been on all of our minds, and that's food security and the vulnerabilities with food security. We've all stood in lines. Something that's very tangible that all of us, I think, can relate to is standing in long lines at the grocery stores to mostly empty shelves to the past 3 months. Recently it's gotten a little better, but the cost of food has doubled. It's becoming a rough situation. So obviously our food system is incredibly vulnerable. And I want to start about, Karen, if you can start us off with discussion around the vulnerability and how that's been affecting the community of our food system.
So thank you so much, Omar. First of all, folks, welcome to my world, because pre-pandemic, the food insecurity issue has been paramount in communities of color throughout the United States. I live in the Bronx, and out of 62 counties in New York State, the Bronx ranks 62 as the most unhealthiest. Our communities are inundated with processed food, junk food, fast food. We are inundated with soup kitchens and food pantries, and this was pre-COVID. And now, since we're in this pandemic, it has really brought to the surface the inequities and inequalities we have in our food system. People say, is the food system broken and needs to be fixed? And I said, heck no. It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's a caste system based on race, based on demographics, based on wealth. It's not broken. It doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to change. And so how do we go about having that conversation on how do we change the food system when we know where the bad food, the subsidized food goes into, mostly poor neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color, and then who controls our food system? A handful of white men. So let's sort of be honest, and let's get to the heart of the matter and start having these conversations, which include a community, on how we're going to change the food system, not how we're going to fix it.
Thank you so much. Molly, very similar question. If you could expand on that a bit more with respect to human rights, the food system, and how, food deserts such as what's happening in the Bronx, structurally is a racist system, is based off of a racist system. You've studied this quite a bit. Karen's lived it, you've studied it, so it's good to have both perspectives.
Thank you, Omar. And let me just say it's a tremendous honor to me to be on a panel with Karen. I've respected her work for years and years. I call myself a scholar activist, but the activist part of me pales next to what Karen's been doing. She is walking the talk every day. So again, I also appreciate the invitation from you folks, and really want to hold up what you're trying to do. I think the March for Science is a great idea, and the principles that are behind it are definitely things that I stand for. Karen gave you a great answer to that already. The inequities in the food system were there already, and COVID-19 have just made those inequities much more stark, much harder for us to ignore. One thing that Karen didn't mention that I'm sure those listening in are aware of are the huge problems that are faced by workers in the food system. Not only farm workers, people who are out picking our food, and if they weren't out there picking that food, harvesting it, we would not have food in the supermarkets, and in many cases, even in our food co-ops. Food co-ops tend to rely on a more local food system, but they fill in. I'm on the board of our local food co-op in Middlebury, and the produce manager fills in when there's not sufficient local supply with whatever she can get. So it's not just farm workers who are forced to work in very close conditions in the field. Conditions are already terrible. Karen was saying it was 102 degrees today in New York. Those are the kinds of conditions that farm workers are facing every day. The people in California, the people in Texas and Florida and North Carolina, all over our country who are picking our food, and then also the workers in processing plants. You're probably all aware of the rise in COVID-19 cases in meatpacking plants, where again, workers are forced to work in close proximity to each other. They aren't being given the personal protective equipment that they need. They aren't being given days off. So a lot of them are undocumented. A lot of them are highly vulnerable because of their undocumented status. Same for people working in the fields. So an additional layer of vulnerability on top of working through a pandemic, staying on the job, because if they don't show up for work, even if they aren't feeling great, if they don't show up for work, they're canned. They don't have a job anymore, and their families are depending on them for that income. So it's not good for any of us. It's certainly not good for consumers who are eating the products from those meatpacking plants. And ironically, at a time that workers in meatpacking plants were suffering such a high incidence of COVID exposure and deaths from COVID, meatpacking plants were considered to be essential workers. So Trump forced those people back to work without personal protective equipment. We don't need their products, honestly, folks. The people in the meatpacking plants definitely needed jobs. They needed unemployment benefits. There's no question about that. But pretending that we needed the products from JBS and Tyson is a lie. The products from those meatpacking plants were being exported to China because China was paying really high prices. And ironically, that was because China had had to kill a whole lot of its pigs because of another pandemic that China had been facing. So human rights violations right and left, particularly for the frontline workers who are working in fields, in meatpacking plants, and also working as cashiers in supermarkets or working in fast food outlets and trying to stay on the job even when they don't feel great because they aren't getting unemployment benefits and not getting personal protective equipment.
Thank you. Yeah, something that Tony Alarcon said last week in our immigration panel. Tony is a Make the Road fellow, a Make the Road New York fellow, and also an undocumented worker. And he said, you know, we're essential. You know, a lot of our community is essential during the pandemic, but we're illegal as soon as it's before and after. And it really speaks to the dehumanization of the workforce that are supplying our foods. Now, you touched on this a little bit with respect to Tyson, and then Karen also touched on it. And it really, could you, whichever one of you wants to go first, can you expand a little bit more on the role of not only white supremacy, but the consolidation of our food systems and basically taking the food systems from these, you know, a lot of farmers and this diverse community to this like 6 meat packing plants, and that's existing across our entire food system.
So, you know, for me as a farmer, as a Black woman, my relationship to agriculture was forced in a negative direction. I mean, Growing up, I never felt as a person of color that I was involved or my people was involved in this food system. The only reference was around slavery. And it wasn't until, I got rid of the falsehoods to find the true meaning of our participation in this food movement, this food system. This food system was built on the backs of enslaved and indigenous people. Let's be real, okay? And as a result, the food has been used as a weapon to keep us down. The food system has been used as a weapon to take us from our land, for white people to come and displace indigenous people, prevent former slaves and people of color to obtain land, because land is power. Land is power. And so now you see a food system whereby people have gone away from the land, mostly in factories, working in factories and going away from the land. And as a result, it has ended, like I said, in the hands of a few people. And this is not a local movement, this is a global movement. This is happening all over the world. That's number one. Number two, who are most of the farmers globally? Are women. And so for so many years, we've lacked that recognition of the power of women in agriculture. That's number one. Number two, the limited terms of resources and technical assistance that's given to women when it comes to agriculture. And so for me, this movement has been co-opted. So the reference around agriculture in these United States and around the world is a perception of white supremacy, that they were the ones that invented the mechanics, the technological information and knowledge around farming. Look at our seed system. How do we have a handful of people controlling our seeds? Indigenous and enslaved people would never thought about owning anything, owning people, owning seeds, owning land. And so now you have this narrative of making food a commodity, making food and water a commodity. And as a result, we're in the situation that we are in now. And so this whole food system, again, has been co-opted. How it was built has been co-opted. Who has power has been co-opted. And so that's why you see so much of people now coming out, marching against the inequities that you see in the food system, that you see when it comes to labor, what you see when it comes to housing and land, because for so long, we have been blinded by a false narrative. And now the truth is starting to surface. And as a result, people are starting to be proactive in readjusting and regaining their power when it comes to the food system.
That was really eloquent, and I agree completely with what Karen said. I would add that it's not just the food system that was built on the backs of brown and black people. It was our entire economic system in the United States. The wealth in this system in our country depends on exploitation, and the wealth in the food system depends on the continued exploitation of black and brown bodies. Our whole cheap food mantra in this country, we believe that we are entitled to cheap food. And I say we because that's the perception of most people in this country. But cheap food means that there are people out there who are being exploited in order to get that lettuce or those tomatoes or whatever into your supermarket. And if we were paying producers and workers fair wages, a decent livable wage, then our food would not be cheap. A lot of people will come back and say, oh, but that's terrible, because then people who are low income couldn't afford to buy healthy food. But the problem there is that it's not only cheap food, it's cheap labor, where so many of the jobs in our system are not paying livable wages. If jobs had livable wages that allowed people to buy healthy food, then we could afford to pay the true cost of that food, what it actually costs in terms of not just human exploitation, but also environmental exploitation. I was trained originally as an ecologist, and it's one of the things that's always in the back of my mind, the way that climate change is connected in with this exploitative system, and the way that loss of biodiversity is creating an uninhabitable planet. We can't continue to have healthy people if our planet is sick, if we're destroying biodiversity. And we need to be keeping that in mind all the time, and also keeping in mind that this destruction of biodiversity is why pandemics are spreading. As the industrialized food system is creeping out, and I shouldn't say creeping out because it's just engulfing, it's swallowing up habitat that used to be where wild species lived. As that continues to happen, not only are the indigenous people being displaced without their consent, this whole idea that you can't sell land without free, prior, and informed consent, that's being abused right and left. Land grabs are happening and ousting indigenous people and the people who had been living in those areas and farming it quite sustainably, sometimes over millennia. Those people are being run out of the best farmland, and corporations in many cases, or government-run enterprises are taking their place. And here pandemics are spreading, climate change is getting worse and worse because this industrialized food system is completely dependent on fossil fuel and on things like purchased inputs, fertilizer that's produced at a very high cost of fossil fuel, and using practices that are increasing climate change instead of agroecological practices that would be sequestering carbon in soil that is increasingly being made more and more fertile. So I've gone on and given you several places that you could pick up, and it's really up to you to decide where you want to go with that, Omar.
Oh, I'm going to go in a lot of ways with that. But first, there is actually a pretty good question to, we're speaking of good jobs and whatnot. There is a fundamental question about what is a living wage that was asked. And you know, I would definitely love for that to be answered, because it is a foundation of not only our farming and our food, but our access to land, food, life, is being able to be paid a fair wage for our work.
That's a great question, and I'm sure Karen will have things to add to this based on her experience, because she's seeing people in the Bronx all the time who don't have a living wage. If they have a job at all, it's not at a living wage. There's a living wage calculator. I think MIT prepared one, and there are others. It varies depending on where you are, because the cost of living is different in different parts of the country. For instance, in the Bronx, the cost of living is a lot higher than it is in Middlebury, Vermont, for a number of reasons. Vermont is quite rural. Urban areas tend to have higher living wages. Burlington is a lot higher than Middlebury. And it depends on whether you have children living in the household with you and they are dependent on you for, oh good, thanks for posting that, Alyssa, the MIT Living Wage Calculator. And you will be astonished at what a living wage is. Partly it's so high because we don't get guaranteed health care in this country. We don't get guaranteed parental leave, guaranteed childcare, a lot of the things that people in Europe can take for granted, like having a whole year off when you have a baby, that you have a guaranteed parental leave and you have guaranteed childcare. We don't have that in this country. Healthcare is outrageously expensive. partly because the pharmaceutical companies are gouging us, partly because the insurance companies are gouging us. It's definitely not to our benefit, trying to make sure that we stay healthy, which is what a healthcare system should be all about. It's about making sure that the insurance companies get a lot of money off us once we're sick, and that a lot of money goes into keeping very old, wealthy people alive, even when their quality of life is not so great. So I'll cut off right there, but take a look at that living wage calculator and you will be astonished, and also astonished at where the poverty line is set in this country. It is way, way below what a living wage is on average in this country.
Thank you so much. And I do want to remind everybody in the audience that scientifically speaking, all the evidence indicates that a single-payer healthcare will save 70,000 lives and billions of dollars. We are paying more in taxpayer dollars as well as personal dollars for our healthcare system for a lower quality service and death. We have 70,000 preventable deaths, that's the estimate, because we don't have a single payer system. Karen, all yours. I just had to give that introduction.
I'm waiting to go because, folks, it doesn't work for us. This sort of capitalist living wage system does not work for us. We found out who the essential workers are, right? The frontline people, the people who work in restaurants, the farmers, the farm laborers that are out there in the field. And so we have to look at what has been an extractive system. And what a lot of us is trying to do is peel back that capitalistic extractive system where poor people collectively are very powerful in the amount of money they have, but that money is extracted out of our community. So how do we now talk about re-educating people to understand their power, the power that they have with communal wealth and social capital? Hello? Words that are not used or talked about in our community, starting to have that education about how to build communal wealth when people who have been demarginalized and poor can come together and put their assets and resources together to build power. This is a construct that's not talking or spoken about in our community. We cannot go in the way of a capitalistic society, feeling that we have to go to work 9 to 5, get some sort of reward, get paid. It doesn't work for us. So then how do we turn the system upside down to say, how do we work together to build wealth by putting money and resources within our community to build economic power, to build entrepreneurship, to build our own system so that people who look like us, that their jobs, their businesses stay within our communities? Because right now with gentrification, things are being extracted. And so now we're looking at a system that is trying to build power within people for so long have been disenfranchised and have been told time and time again that they don't have power. Well, if you take all the poor people and marginalized people in the community and they put in $1, and with that dollar that helps build enterprise, purchase land, businesses, things started to change, but that conversation doesn't happen in our community now. But now it's starting to happen because we know that the system doesn't work for us. So then how do we build communal wealth? Well, access to land, access to capital, but capital in a way that it's not extractive, but builds wealth within our community, and having those hard conversations of what that looks like, getting people to invest their dollars and their resources within their community for so long, have been told that they're poor, that they can't do it, they have to get a welfare, they have to get a food pay. No, making people understand that the power is right there. If we work collectively to build within our community, and that's where we're going now. That's the future of the conversation that we're having in our community, because we know right now that the capitalistic system does not work for us. We will never build wealth if we continue to think that we're going to go to a job 9 to 5 and build power. It's not going to happen. It's not going to build wealth. we have to re-educate ourselves and look within our community in terms of building wealth. And that's what a lot of us are doing now.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You know, I actually I had a small Freudian slip when I was talking about a living wage and I said a fair wage. There is an element, there's a component of the movement also of worker ownership, of, you know, you're seeing this increased worker unionization, you're seeing this increased worker demand for, you know, if I'm working for this company, I'm not only going to get paid my salary, and the salary is going to be based off of the value that I add to this company, not based off what my boss decides my value is, but the actual value that I'm adding to the company. But I also want ownership of this company. I also want ownership, you know, have strong, and apparently this is something that's quite common around the world. It's a uniquely American thing that, and a very capitalist American thing that, you know, our boss tells us our wage and we say yes and take it on our backs.
Can I just add one thing to that question? Because I think it's very important when we talk about the essential workers. You know, someone says, well, how do we go back? And I say, if these are essential workers, then the people in these restaurants that have been working, they need to go back and be part ownership of the restaurant because they're essential workers. All these people, they're essentials, they're needed. Then if they're going to go back, then they have to go back as co-owners of the restaurants and the businesses that they worked with before. COVID has opened our eyes. We cannot go back to the way things are. It has changed the playing field. And so we move forward, then we have to move forward and we recognize what essential workers, then we have to recognize putting the power back into the hands of people that need it the most. So I'm telling all those essential workers, if you want to go back to the restaurant, you make sure that you're a part owner of that restaurant. You have some sort of input because you have been deemed essential.
Dr. Anderson, any input?
Yeah. Several things come to mind. I agree completely. Worker ownership is the future. And there are plenty of examples around the world. Mondragon is held up frequently in Spain. It's been quite successful in bringing wealth back to an area that had been stripped of its wealth by extraction, which Karen raised quite rightly as the core problem, that our neoliberal system is extractive. It's not only racist, but it's also extractive, and it's sucking wealth out of communities. It's sucking everything, the soul out of communities, but people can resist that. Worker ownership, cooperatives, those are examples of a different kind of ownership structure that can fight back against neoliberalism. And it's neoliberalism that is the form of capitalism that we have in this country now, which is immensely destructive of people. It's immensely destructive of communities. It's just hollowing out farming communities all through our country. They cannot survive. And it's sucking all that wealth up to the top, up to those few people who have power in concentrated food businesses. So we would do well to look at examples around the world of how people have fought back. We'd also do well to look at the whole history of unionization. One of the reasons that workers have so little power now is because once neoliberalism came in and became the established system, unions were eradicated. They were destroyed systematically. Once upon a time, union membership was much higher, and unions were a way that workers actually could gain some power vis-a-vis the managers in a company. And when everybody was unionized, or virtually everybody was unionized, then the managers had relatively little power, but the unions have been stripped. And that was a big part of the Reagan era of fighting unions and making sure that they were decimated.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Worker rights. We're actually going to speak a bit more on it in in a future panel. I believe it might be our next panel on economics and workers' rights. So I'm going to bring it back a little bit to the food system, and I'm going to actually keep it with the concept of building power within the food system. And we talked about this we usually have a pre-panel discussion to those in the audience to coordinate. And I actually asked about regenerative farming and their views on regenerative farming. And the reason I asked for this is because my introduction to regenerative farming is that it's a movement to return to indigenous land practices and return to the land. And I was actually reminded that informed that that's not true. And they mentioned this a couple of times about agroecology. So can you both speak a little bit more about the difference between regenerative farming and agroecology and the importance of making sure that our farming is based in a movement and not just some sort of technical concept?
How do you want to handle that, Karen? I know both of us have strong ideas on that.
Yeah, so when we talk about agroecology and regenerative practice, I want to make sure that people understand where the context of what we're talking about, because it seems like everyone comes up with a new iteration of what this food movement needs to be, with not really thinking about the power of indigenous people have had from the beginning. So when we talk about agroecology, we're talking about looking at science and practice. And what does that look like? So that looks like people organizing themselves around their community, around communal power. And this is something when I went to Cuba a couple of years ago, really learned a lot about agroecology, because it's a system that's based on science, as I said, but also indigenous practices, communal power, how you work together systemically, how it's based around a lot of the indigenous practices that people have learned, passed on from generation to generations. It's not about it's about we. It's about sharing knowledge. It's about seed saving. It's about understanding the communal family order of the husband and wife, of children, of community, and how that interlocks and intertwines in the work of soil management, environmental conservation, of being self-reliant and self-determined to be powerful and understanding where your power is in owning land and owning the concept of self-governance. And I think that's important when you talk about agroecology, which for me is totally different from regenerative practice of what they're saying what is today. My take. Molly, add to it.
Yeah, a lot of people will define agroecology as science, practice, and movement. And the movement part of it is a lot of what Karen just described, that really powerful political side of agroecology. And that is precisely why many people in this country prefer the term regenerative agriculture. And you find that in some international forums too. I was just looking at something that the Global Alliance on the Future of Food had put together about a shared narrative for food system transformation. And they like to talk about agroecology, regenerative and circular economy. But wow, those three ideas come from very different places. Agroecology rose up out of that movement, largely out of La Via Campesina, which is a movement of millions of peasants around the world. And it is incredibly powerful. These are the people who produce most of the food that's consumed in the world. The Food and Agriculture Organization of FAO says 70% or so, 70 to 80% of the food that's consumed in the world is produced by very small farms. It's not produced by these corporations. It's not produced by the huge farms that we see if we drive across the United States. It's produced on those very small farms, and a large percentage of those farms are using agroecological practices, partly because those are traditional practices, indigenous practices, partly because they minimize external inputs. The farmers don't have to buy chemicals, pesticides, or fertilizer from a company somewhere. Once they start doing that, they get into debt. And the debt is a killer, especially in places like India, where the Green Revolution and industrialized farming have been heavily promoted. Farmers go into debt to buy these inputs, and then they lose their land, they lose everything they've got, and they commit suicide. It's a huge tragedy of farmers who are indebted, who see no way out, and shame coming back to their family, so they commit suicide. Agroecological practices are closely connected with the concept of food sovereignty, which again is highly politicized. That has a set of principles that go with it, including respecting women's rights, land reform, so that the land is going back to those very small scale farmers who have been producing most of the food, but who in many cases are still hungry. They don't have enough land to produce enough food for their families. So even though they are producing most of the food, it's still not enough. And they are over 50% of that group of people who are chronically undernourished worldwide. There was a big report that just came out, it comes out every year, called the SOFI, or the State of Food Security in the World. And it says that food insecurity is rising, partly because of COVID, partly because of climate change, partly because of conflict. And a lot of that conflict is over resources, especially water and access to land, the things that people must have in order to produce food. So power has got to be redistributed to benefit those people who are most vulnerable and who have been marginalized politically, so that they don't have a voice in most forums. They can't speak for themselves and demand that power back. So going back to what Karen was saying, of people realizing that their voice is what matters, and they have to come together and work collectively to demand power. She's absolutely right. It's social movements that have created every major social change that we've ever seen in the world. The French Revolution, which was started by people who were starving. The wealthy classes had taken away their land, taken away far too much of their power, and they demanded bread. Here's Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat cake. And they're saying, we need bread. And they couldn't get it. So they overturned the whole political system. And that happened during the 2007 to 2008 food price crisis, where again, over 1 million people were pushed into the ranks of the chronically undernourished. We are looking at that now with COVID, more and more people falling into that chronically undernourished category, and they will not tolerate it. It's something that creates more and more political instability.
Absolutely. So as an Egyptian who's witnessed the Egyptian revolution, you know, our chants were عيش حرية كرامة إنسانية عدالة اجتماعية, or bread, dignity, human rights, and you know, so the concept bread was the first, عيش is the first demand. So it's always, you know, and this is something that we saw again in the 2008 riots in Egypt, and you know, this is a reoccurring theme, is the lack of access to food. People will ask, no matter how totalitarian the regime is, no matter how oppressive the government is, access to food is critical. And
Food and
speaking
water.
of taking, and water, yeah, Egypt's about to actually go into a water war potentially with Ethiopia. They're currently in negotiations. Hopefully it works out. I don't want to imagine a war breaking out.
Yeah,
So,
Arab
go for
Spring
it.
hasn't been completely successful. Bread was a major beginning of Arab Spring, and people seizing political power and saying, we won't tolerate this inequity anymore. The problem there is that people have to hang on to it. They need a strategy for retaining that power and transforming the system. As Karen was explaining, we can't go back. The system that we had before was completely inequitable. It was completely racist. There's no way we can go back to that system. We've got to transform it. But once it's been transformed, those corporations are not going to sit there quietly and say, oh, you want a little more power? Well, sure, we'll share power with you. We'll give you more money. We'll start producing healthy food. No, they're going to do everything in their power to fight back. So it's this continuing struggle of fighting for power, maintaining the power, changing the narrative so that people understand that the neoliberal system is not working in their interest in the least. It's working in the interest of a few white people. And I say white, knowing that there are folks like Rajiv Shah, who's now there, he's Indian, and he's now at the Rockefeller Foundation. There are people who've been co-opted, who are still fighting for the interests of white supremacy. So you point to a few people, and that just proves, even though there are a few people of color in that system, it basically proves there's so few of them. It proves that it's basically a white supremacist system. Sorry, Omar, you were starting to say something.
No, I just wanted to take a moment to give a shout out to all the revolutionaries in the Arab Spring and around the world. You know, the coup in Egypt in 2013, and you can even argue that the coup happened before that, where people lost their lives, lost their freedoms, lost 50 to 60,000 people right now are estimated in political prisons, 5,000 to 6,000 people have estimated to be shot in the street. In Bolivia, you have from the water revolution where, in Cochabamba and whatnot, now you have the revolutionary government has been overthrown to what's essentially a right-wing, far-right, racist, anti-indigenous government that had their first action was to open the country up to multinational corporations that explicitly benefit from the destruction of ownership in Bolivia. And the concept of holding power after you gain power in a revolutionary sense is something that is overwhelming. As someone who's seen a revolution firsthand, it's one of the most overwhelming things. It's beautiful to watch as people gain power and keep power from the streets and whatnot, but it's also devastating to see the bloodlust of the people who don't want a revolution to succeed. For my own mental health, let's move on from the conversation of revolution to something to like global revolution and coup d'etats, and to something that is still revolutionary in and of itself, but specific actions or policies that can be pushed for to strengthen and empower communities to build and retain wealth through food. This was a question asked, and I modified it a little bit. Sorry, Matthew, but I'm assuming that was the concept.
Yeah, you know what? I'm still waiting for my 40 acres. Forget about the mule. I mean, we're starting to think about reparations, about, giving back to land that was stolen from people. Understanding the treaties that have been out there to make sure that they're followed. There's a movement now really thinking about what that looks like. You know, white people are getting afraid because they says, well, what do you mean? And, you know, it wasn't our fault what happened, you know, 200-300 years ago, you know, but the fact is like a lot of the wealth that you've attained has been on the backs of indigenous and enslaved people. And so how do we go forward in such a way to think about reparations in a way of people giving back to land, especially to young Black and brown farmers? Also in terms of how can I say, giving in resources, sharing resources. One thing about power is that, you know, power is a drug, and like Molly said, it's going to be hard to give up that power. White people in positions are not going to give up that power. So I tell people three things: either you're going to give it up, you're going to share it, or it's going to be taken away. And so and we talked about, I think we sort of entered this conversation about voting. And so we're 98 days away from voting. And so again, looking at a powerful act of changing the system in a way that benefits you. One thing about changing a system that we have to be very, very careful if we want to talk about changing the capitalistic system, changing the food system, changing wealth inequality, that we don't replicate the oppressor. That all of a sudden we got power and then we walk the fundamental ways of the oppressor. And so we have to be very mindful as we go through these critical movements of what you are seeing now, because after 400 years, Black Lives Matter? What? And so how do we talk about communal base building, social capital, communal wealth, reparations, in a way that restores the power within the community? You know, for so long, I think we've lost our power. You know, I have this conversation when we talk about Civics 101, because when people say, oh, the government owns this and that, but the thing is, like, the government only owns or do things because we allow it to happen. And people have to understand is that the government is made of people. We put people in office to do the things that they're supposed to do for us. And so then how do we strategically think about regaining that power so that people that we put in office are accountable? We have lost that. We have sat back. I tell you, two things that fail a movement is complacency and silence. Two things that were wrecked. And for so long, we have been complacent and silent, and this is why we have the leadership that we have today. And so when we frame this conversation around voting and power, let's look at what we can do collectively to come together to change the political system in such a way that it benefits all people, but a system that doesn't replicate what has happened, because history has a sense of repeating itself. And so you can't gain power and then replicate an extractive, racist, capitalistic, white supremacist system. So we'll be very, very careful in how we create what power means in our communities.
I can add just a few things to that. And I agree completely. Karen, Omar, if you were hoping that Karen and I would debate or have very different views, I hope you're not terribly disappointed, because I'm behind Karen 100%. This election that's coming up is hugely important. Anybody who's paying attention knows that Trump is an authoritarian, and he is doing his best to wreak havoc, to create chaos, and to steal the upcoming November election. So we have got to mobilize and prevent that happening. We've got to get rid of, flip the Senate so that Mitch McConnell, that corrupt, evil man, so that he is out of power and Trump is out of power. This is such an important election. So everybody's got to be engaged. Everybody's got to be trying to mobilize the vote, which is wonderful for you folks. You're doing what you can. I want to call out a couple of other things. One, there's a book that a friend just published, Shanna Ratner. It's called Wealth Creation, and it's about communities regaining their wealth. And I would recommend that book. She's really smart. And it will give you some ideas for how communities can regain their collective wealth. Another thing that I would strongly recommend to everyone on this call is to do a crash course in anti-racism. You need to gather your anti-racist muscles so that you can be reflexive and see what's happening in our country, because racism is behind so many of the evil acts that the Republican-controlled Senate is trying to enact, and so many of the evil acts that the Trump administration is enacting. And forgive me if I'm being a little too partisan here, but we've got serious, serious things on the line. Our whole democracy is on the line. And unless we see what's happening and see the power of racism in our country, we are not going to fight this. As long as white people refuse to address our own white privilege, we will not turn this system around.
I'd like to recommend one book that I'm starting to read too. It's called The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap by Mahersha Baradaran, I'm sorry. I'm starting to read that book because she talks about how wealth was built in the Black community and how we had this racial gap. And it wasn't because Black people didn't have knowledge when it came to wealth. It was the systems that were in place to prevent Blacks from obtaining wealth through the banking system, through housing systems, through all these systems. So I'm starting to read that book, and I can't put it down because I'm learning so much about the history myself when it comes to wealth within my people.
And as far as anti-racist readings, you will find a whole number of book lists, reading lists. I bet you anything that there are several book groups right around you that you could join to talk with people, to get some support for tackling these really difficult issues.
And attend the Soulfire Undoing Racism series, definitely, if everyone should be taking that.
That's a great farm and wonderful people who started up that project.
Thank you so much. We will reach out to you guys for links to all that if we miss any links in the process. But I will say that thank you for recommending The Color of Money, because we just got our 501c3 status, and so we are looking to find a bank account. So that was something we voted on, is to find a Black-owned bank and put our money in a Black-owned bank that can handle a 501c3. So we'll read that, because we're still doing our research on which bank to choose. Something I want to close us out with, I know it's getting to the hour, so the last question, and thank you both so much, is the relationship of climate change and food. And we talked about this, we mentioned it a few times with respect to regenerative farming. You mentioned, restructuring our farming systems with respect to, people want specific policies of restructuring our farming systems with respect to racial justice and human rights and land rights and indigenous rights. Please look into the Green New Deal with the Red Deal addendum, and look into the Red Deal and how it ties into the Green New Deal and the importance of both. But something I wanted to talk about too is, my background's in vertical farming, and one of the big things that we talk about is, loss of biodiversity, people basically loss of ability to farm in a lot of this world, and how food security ties into the loss of the ability to farm around the world, and what that means with respect to colonization, food sovereignty, and human rights and access to food. And that's something that really exists in the vertical farming, hydroponic, and aquaponic space, is you know, trying to figure out a way to, after climate change wrecks us, and it looks like if we don't take drastic action now, it might do its worst. How do we still farm?
I have reservations, Omar, about vertical farming. And I know you're working on that. A lot of vertical farms are really heavy energy users. So that's one of the dilemmas with vertical farming, how to do that without using too much energy from non-renewable sources. So that's one issue. A second issue is that a lot of the things that people eat can't really be grown in vertical farms. It's not great for grains. It's great for greens, but not for grains. So one thing about climate change and food systems, well, two things actually, and then I'll turn it over to Karen. One thing is that local food systems tend to be far more resilient. We certainly saw that with COVID-19, that they withstood that perturbation a lot better than the industrialized food system. The industrialized food system both contributes to climate change and is quite vulnerable to climate change because food's being moved all over the world in that system. One of the impacts of climate change that we're likely to see that we have not come to grips with is migration of large numbers of people around the world who used to be farming, but they can no longer farm where they used to live because it's too dry and too hot, or they can't live there because it's too hot. So those people need to go somewhere, and they truly need to be met with welcoming arms and embraced as new residents, people who can contribute to a Green New Deal, instead of this hostility that our country has targeted immigrants with so far. I could say a lot more, but I want to leave a little time for Karen too.
You know,
take your time. No rush. Take your time. We're not. We have no technical reason to stop. We're just for your time and in respect of your time. That's why we're wrapping up.
you know, this question comes to me all the time, and so I'm going to just say this because I'm tired of hearing people saying that the future of farming is in urban agriculture. And my thing is like, I don't care. I want people to grow food. You know what I'm saying? You know, there's this, I'm serious, there's this sort of thing between it's urban, it's rural, it's hydroponics, it's aquaponics. And again, it's a divisive mechanism that is used so that people are torn against each other, going for, again, that mighty dollar, and not looking at the importance of food. In this country, we grow enough food and we waste enough food, but that food is not getting down to the people that need it the most. That's number one. We need to think about growing more efficiently instead of growing more food. Growing efficiency. And then we have to talk about how our food is handled, how it goes from the seed to the plate, and who's affected along the way, the food chain. We need to talk about that. So for me, it's not about vertical versus hydroponics, aquaponics, community gardens, rural farms. It's about how do we grow food efficiently so that we can feed the population. Right now, if we look at the whole thing around food and hunger and poverty, food and water are two things that are human rights. And so we get caught up into particular who's growing better. And we also need to think about going back to plant-based food. I mean, back in the day, 70% of food came from farms. We were more plant-based. So our caloric intake was like 2,000 calories. Now it's over 3,800 calories because now we're animal-based. And so we have to look at our food system in such a way as to what's best for the planet and what's best for our bodies. And so I tell people, if you want to grow food, if you don't have a community garden or farm, grow on your windowsill. You know, grow on your terrace. Getting people to understand where their food comes from is so, so important. And if you're able to put your hand in the ground and then talk about food in such a way, then that's where the conversation should start. When we talk about agriculture, we need to talk about the culture of food. And the one common denominator that brings us all together around this global world is food. And so how do we come together to make sure that we are growing food efficiently and that food is getting down to the people that need it the most, and not be caught up in semantics? Well, aquaponics is better than, and hydroponics is better, and that's the way of the future. It ain't the way of the future, because again, like Molly said, a lot of that stuff is not what people need to eat. So then how do we come together? And especially in my neighborhood, those hydroponics and aquaponics, that food is not in our neighborhood. That goes to the hospitals and high-end restaurants. Let's be, be honest about that. That food that is grown is not going into people up in the Bronx and in marginalized or poor communities. That's an elitist food that is going to high-end restaurants and kitchens. So let's be real about that too.
100%. Sorry, go for it. I'm loving this. Go for it.
It's important not just to grow food more efficiently, but to grow healthy food and diverse food. So much of the crops that are grown in this country are going, like corn, it's going into ethanol and animal feed. Those are the major places it goes. And then some of it goes into bioproducts, like those compostable, supposedly compostable. They don't really compost unless you've got a really high heat composting system, but compostable this and that. We need people growing healthy food and growing food that will serve diverse diets for everyone, so that everyone can realize their right to food.
100% from both of you. Last thing that I really have to say is that point that both of them made just now, that it's not just technology, it's about the people. In March Science, we fundamentally believe that science is for the public good, it's for the common good. We can't just say, the thing that I really wanted to bring up with aquaponics or hydroponics with respect to Green New Deal and all that is that there is no one-cut solution to climate change. And food, we can say, oh, food is the way we're going to do this, regenerative farming, agroecology, whatever. But ultimately, there's a multifaceted system. What they touched on is immigration, human rights, medicine, workers' rights, how food ties into all this, how your access to all these things tie into all this. So like you need to look at your food systems holistically. You need to look at how to address climate change holistically. You need to vote with respect to how each one of these ties into each other. I think if anything is to be taken from this conversation is how embedded our food is with our everyday life, and how building a movement around food is important, and building our culture and our community around food and our sovereignty around food is important, which is the agroecological message that Karen and Molly gave us today. And really, thank you so much for both of you. You're both legends. I really appreciate you both being here and being with us and talking to us about this. It means a lot to us. Thank you all for coming out to this conversation and for coming and seeing our two awesome panelists and for giving us your time. I'll let you go have dinner. Enjoy your day. Thank you so much. And seriously, I'm so happy that this panel got put together.
Thanks for inviting us.
Bye,
it was an honor.
Thank you. Bye, Molly.
Bye.